So Mitterrand defeats Jacques Chirac in the presidential election of 1988, reasonably comfortably in the end. And he decides to try and repeat the trick that he had pulled off in 1988. By what I mean, that he wants to call another election. If you remember in 1981, he immediately dissolved the National Assembly in order to try and create a socialist majority in the Assembly as well. He decides to do the same thing. Some members of the Parti Socialiste are sceptical. They're afraid that this might lead to more losses for the Parti Socialiste. They're afraid that it's more Mitterrand's personal popularity than anything that had led to his victory in the presidential election. That might not translate into many votes in the National Assembly election. But Mitterrand is confident that the polls show there is a growing support for left-wing parties once again. So he decides to roll the dice, have another election, and this time you see the results. So the Parti Socialiste returns as the largest party of the National Assembly. It has enough support from the rest of the French political left to earn Mitterrand not an enormous but a relatively stable majority. And so therefore, at least for the next 5 years, similar to his first term, Mitterrand is going to have a socialist or at least a left-leaning National Assembly that should be sympathetic towards him. As Prime Minister, he appoints Michel Rocard, who was his kind of heir-in-waiting in the Parti Socialiste, who was and made no secret of that fact, and was kind of very ambitious to become president himself one day. Rocard was kind of, again, more evidence that the Parti Socialiste was moving away from its more traditional Marxist backgrounds. He was much more moderate in terms of his economic policies, and although he stopped the old Chirac policy, or the policies that Jacques Chirac's government had introduced, such as cutting taxes and privatizing national French industries, this was certainly not a return to the old school, big government spending of traditional French conservative or traditional French socialism. He also, one of the most interesting parts of his political career was that there was a dispute in New Caledonia, which is a French colony in Micronesia, and there had been an effort among some people in New Caledonia to overthrow French rule there. Some French police officers were seized and held hostage, and Rocard managed to negotiate the release of the hostages and an agreement with the representatives of New Caledonia that would allow for greater local government and eventually paved the way for a referendum on independence. As it happens, that referendum wasn't held until 2018, and then the people of New Caledonia decided to remain part of France. But Rocard and Mitterrand disagreed on numerous policies, and as the Parti Socialiste still wasn't doing particularly well in polls, Mitterrand dismissed him and replaced him with Edith Cresson, France's first Prime Minister, in 1991. You can see she's not going to actually remain in office for very, very long. And one reason for that is that she, like kind of Jean-Marie Le Pen, had a habit of making controversial statements that were not particularly welcome amongst many people in the French left. So, for example, she compared the Japanese businessmen who were trying to expand into France and then the general economic growth of Japan in the 1980s. The Japanese were yellow ants trying to take over the world. She also said, homosexuality seems strange to me. It's different and marginal. It exists more in the Anglo-Saxon tradition than the Latin one. And so this kind of habit of putting her foot in her mouth, coupled with the fact that French polls continue to show that the Parti Socialiste was declining as a political force, meant that Mitterrand replaced her in 1992 with Pierre Bérégovoy. And he was, although as you see, his reign is also going to be relatively short, in part because an election is going to have to be held in 1993. Another interesting aspect of Mitterrand's policy during his second term. So firstly, here's your Jeopardy question. This treaty, named after a Dutch city and signed in 1992, created the European Union. What is the Maastricht Treaty? So this was a treaty that more or less established the modern European Union as we know it. And Mitterrand decided to offer a vote to the French people on whether they would back the treaty or not. And France had been relatively pro-European in its policies over the last couple of decades, but growing discontent with the socialist government, and also with concern that maybe this Maastricht Treaty was paving the way for a more federal Europe, meant that it was actually a very close-run thing. Contrary to Mitterrand's expectations, the French public almost, so they did vote to accept the Maastricht Treaty, but it was very close, and had they voted against it, it would have destroyed the Maastricht Treaty. There might not be a European Union today as we know it, and it would have been a complete humiliation for Mitterrand. As it was very embarrassing that the vote was as close as it was. 1993, another French election. The 5 years of the National Assembly are up, and the result is, as predicted, the Socialist Party does terrible. You can see it only wins 53 seats. So compared to the Rally for the Republic, de Gaulle or Jacques Chirac's party, it returns very, very small returns. A complete annihilation for the Parti Socialiste in this election. And one of the consequences was that Pierre Bérégovoy commits suicide a couple of months after the election. That, according to his friends, he had taken the loss in the election very, very badly, blamed himself for not being able to try and do more to rally the party. And in addition, he had been involved in a financial scandal in which a variety of French, basically he had taken a loan from a businessman, no interest loan, from a businessman who'd been convicted of insider trading. And even though there was no wrongdoing proven around Bérégovoy's activity, it certainly didn't help him either. And it seems to have played a role in his decision to commit suicide. He was replaced as Prime Minister by, Edouard Balladur. So Chirac obviously is the leader of the rally for the people, rally for the Republic, but he's learned his lesson from cohabitation. In order to avoid what happened to him in 1986, ending up being blamed for all of France's problems by being Prime Minister, he decides to allow one of his allies go forward instead as Prime Minister of as Prime Minister. So this is Mitterrand's second experience of what we call cohabitation. Mitterrand's second term as president, to some extent, was marked with a degree of scandal as well, especially in the later years. Firstly, people found out in the mid-90s that he'd been battling colon cancer for over a decade, which a lot of people kind of associated with a degree of kind of lack of forthrightness with the voters. They felt that given that the French president sits in term for 7 years, given that Mitterrand was 72 when he ran was elected the second time, he should have been more forthright. It also turned out he had a daughter with a mistress, which, I mean, frankly, in terms of French political scandals, wasn't all that onerous. But some of the more serious scandals connected with Mitterrand was about his past. It emerged that he had actually been involved with various fascist organizations in France in the 1930s. There was also questions about his work with the Vichy government, that he had basically had fought for the French army, had been captured by the Germans in June 1940 during the French invasion. But for a time he had served as a liaison between the Vichy government and French prisoners of war back in Germany. And some people said that this was kind of evidence that perhaps he was something of a Vichy collaborator. And it was something he had certainly downplayed and not really drawn much attention to throughout most of his political career. And this was the scandal associated with Mitterrand personally was part of a wider kind of French kind of coming to terms with the past of the Vichy government. So the guy pictured on the left, Klaus Barbie, was an SS officer. He was put on trial in Germany in 1987 for his crimes as a Nazi war criminal. And over the course of his trial, he revealed that many top French officials in the government of France, and what I mean by that is people who had served in the French government after the fall of the Vichy regime, had actually played some kind of a role in the future French government or the French governments thereafter. One man was Paul Tourvier, pictured here. He had served with the French militia. If you remember, that was the French paramilitary militia, the pro-Nazi militia, or at least the Vichy militia that collaborated with the Nazis. And his political career had been protected not just by Mitterrand was one, but by Georges Pompidou as well. And there was a whole range of revelations about former French officials of the Vichy government, or in Tourvier's case of the militia, who had very complicated relationships with the Nazis during the 1940s, and yet who had survived, in some cases thrived, in the French politics and French political administrations after the Second World War, oftentimes protected by high-ranking French officials, including Mitterrand. And perhaps another blow to Mitterrand's legacy in France came with the Rwandan genocide of 1994. Rwanda was a French colony or former French colony. The French government had supplied considerable arms and amount of weapons to the Hutu regime that in 1994 began massacring the Tutsi population in France. And the accusation wasn't so much that the French were responsible for the genocide in of itself, but that the French government actually did very little to intervene once those events began, because the French government had more influence over the Rwandan government than any other world government. And a lot of people felt the French government had essentially stood by and not done much of anything when it could have. And this image here is after the kind of genocide is over, a French soldier trying to separate communities and put barbed wire between them. So Mitterrand's legacy, what was his legacy as a French politician? Kind of more complicated than Charles de Gaulle's legacy in some ways. Some people criticised his grand projects, his big building measures, which had definitely brought a new vision to Paris, but also which cost a great deal. He was certainly responsible for binding France ever more closely to the European Union, and in some ways undermining his own kind of socialist credentials by ensuring that future French governments could never really kind of enact the dramatic socialist legislation they would want, because their spending powers were curtailed by involvement with the European Union. Economically, again, a mixed bag. There was some success in terms of inflation, which had been a problem in France for several decades prior to the Second World War even, had finally been brought under control under his reign. Yet at the same time, unemployment also grew. Unemployment grew from about 1.5 million at the beginning of his reign in 1981 to over 3 million by the early 1990s. The Communist Party had been kind of defeated as an element of, or as a major force in French politics, but in some ways its place had been taken by the Front National, which some people consider to be an even more problematic political party than the Communist Party. And so, Mitterrand, his second term ends in 1995, and the kind of high regard he'd been held for a long time in French society had begun to fade away because of the scandals that had emerged. And actually himself, Mitterrand, did not last long after his second term. He died only 7 months, so his term was finished in May 1995. He died in January 1996. So that brings our talk on the Mitterrand years to a conclusion, and hopefully you're starting to get a sense of how modern French politics have been kind of shaped by relatively recent events dating back to the Mitterrand presidency of the 1980s and first part of the 1990s.